Okay, the one thing I'd do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive would be to move values education and human relationships education from the hidden curriculum of the playground to the core curriculum in every school.
I would make sure that every single child got the very best education possible and every person had access to affordable tertiary education.
Ensuring people with disabilities have a say in decision making.
Legalise same-sex marriage.
I would like everyone to know through education that with rights come responsibilities, and there are always two sides to every story, so that if a person could put themselves in the other's shoes, they might gain a better understanding.
I think to be more fair, Queensland should stop treating 17-year-olds as adults in the criminal and corrections systems. And to be more inclusive, I think we need to really do something about Indigenous disadvantage. And to me that means actually thoroughly and properly considering the issues and causes, because without doing that and understanding the actual issues contributing to the problems, we're never going to see real change.
I'd like free barbecues in the city gardens.
It would be to provide more social housing for vulnerable people and to change the mindset that social housing is like a ghetto.
I'd make the study of history compulsory at school till year 12. You can't understand today's world without knowing its past.
If I was going to do one thing, it would be to look to the rights of Aboriginal women in particular, and women in general.
Now, our legislation, our Anti-Discrimination Act, it needs to be inclusive. Currently it's exclusive, and it needs to be far more inclusive.
If there's one thing to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, would be two things for me. Firstly, get some funds from the government, let's say, to then spend on sign language interpreters out there in the community so we can access different events. Secondly, on TV news, it would be great to have a sign language person to give us updates on the news so the deaf community can see what is happening around the world or around Australia, or even Queensland itself, of course.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland a more fair and inclusive place, it would be to raise awareness towards rangers and the effects that bullying can have on them.
I come from a multicultural school, so I've learnt how to be tolerant of other racial groups and other ethnic groups and other religious groups even, and that's really helped me to be a really tolerant person, and so I think that is an important thing. So yeah, to increase the amount of education programs in schools for people to become more tolerant of racial groups.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to increase awareness about how other people can support those who are unfairly treated.
If there was one thing I could do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to ensure that people with disabilities have the same rights and accesses as everyone else.
To make Queensland a more fair and inclusive place, I think starts with the internet, to get more internet access to people in remote communities, particularly remote Aboriginal communities, would be a very beneficial thing, and I think they're the people that really need it the most.
The government has a policy of inclusion in schools for all special or lots of special needs kids, but I would like to see it supported more. That schools need to have more funding to support the inclusion of these children.
More disabled public toilets and more disabled buses, so disabled people can get on buses and stuff.
If there was one thing I could do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to have free ice cream.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, would be to foster an education in a fun and inclusive way of all different cultures, especially the native Aboriginal peoples of our land, and foster that from a young age with children, with education and cross-cultural experiences, so that we all grew up just finding it normal.
I'd redraft all legislation in plain English.
There's very strong research that shows that, when you're chatting with a mate, you talk about your problems. And how cool would that be for people? We'd all live happier lives and be healthier as a result.
I think focus on the primary school, because that's the part of society where everyone passes through the doors. Everyone goes to primary school, get the kids working together there, whether it's special programs or just the regular program. We remember for all our life what we learned as kids. That's where we develop our attitudes.
The one thing I'd do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive would be to improve the palliative care supports so that people can die with dignity in their own homes rather than being in hospital at the end of their lives.
If there was one thing we would do at ATSLS to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to continue promoting the concept of cultural competence in schools, workplaces, state and federal departments, with a view to developing a deeper understanding of the skills we all need to communicate effectively, appropriately and respectfully with each other.
The one thing that I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive is to give fathers equal access to paternity leave regardless of type of employment, or who your employer is, or your income level.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to make the Aboriginals have the similar rights to the Maori in New Zealand.
I think taking it back to basics, valuing human life, having that respect, and recognising that we are people who need to live on this earth all together, as John Lennon had with his song Imagine. And free ice cream week. I reckon the government should pay for it. Free ice cream week for everyone in Queensland. But if they want to spend more money, give everyone $1 million each.
I would ensure that legislation was passed so that primary schools in Queensland would have cross-cultural awareness programs. And have a day where you speak to a stranger from a different culture.
I would eliminate pornography.
I would make it mandatory throughout Queensland that everyone is to give another person a compliment or a stranger a compliment every day.
I try to encourage people to show a little bit more empathy and understanding for different people's beliefs and backgrounds.
I'd make the cost of childcare tax deductible.
I would educate the public about the benefit of being reasonable people. That is, no matter how challenged they may be about the views or lifestyles of other people, they do not have a right to impose their views on people who are different to them.
It would be to provide places in the major towns and cities throughout Queensland for disadvantaged groups, regardless of what they are, where they could meet in groups and with other disadvantaged people without fear or concern for their safety.
I will focus on our ability, not our disabilities.
It would be to have a legal system that reflects the principles of social justice.
To ensure that every child in every school has access to the information and education that they need about sexuality and relationships.
It would be to introduce mental health and disability services into the secondary school education system.
It would be to work hand in hand with everyone, especially the disadvantaged people, so that their voices are heard by everyone and they can also make their contribution in the society.
Probably a greater understanding of people's needs.
Build an Aboriginal complex to get us back on track.
I would encourage a whole-of-journey approach to the provision of transport for passengers with temporary and permanent disabilities.
Well, I would continue to have an open mind and take into consideration other people's cultural values and beliefs, and also as a community be more acceptant of members of the LGBT community.
Never to become complacent about the good work that's already being done in our inclusive communities.
Fulfilling an Australian dream, a dream of living and working together in peace and harmony. And thanks Australia for accepting us migrants.
It would be to introduce integral yoga into the schools, because this would help the students become more peaceful and balanced in body and mind.
I would stop all the political spin and the media spin, and I would treat all people with dignity, respect and justice, including myself, including ourselves.
I'd make more roads and pretty the city up a bit, and I'd clean the plates up a bit, and I'd go fishing a bit.
Well, I would lead by example by treating people, both visitors and locals, fairly and equally.
I would get both major political parties to agree to work towards building inclusive communities.
I would like to see a society where people with disability are included, where they're valued, just like any other citizen, of equal value.
Acceptance of diversity within the community and a fair and just media based on truth and sensitivity and cultural acceptance.
I'd establish state-funded boarding schools and university campuses in rural areas like Mount Isa and Longreach, so that people didn't have to send their children so far away to be educated.
To combat the perception of homophobia in regional Queensland.
To introduce a K-12 education system on the issues of lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgender and intersex of Queensland.
It would be to have a social centre in Queensland where all the diverse communities can get together and share information, knowledge and friendship, or get to know each other.
If there's one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be the abolishing of the mandatory detention and sending less people to jail.
If there is one thing I would like to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be appreciating people for the value they bring, not for where they're coming from.
If there's one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to tackle racism directly. We really need people to understand what behaviour is not okay and is against the law. That's what I would do.
I would like Queensland to be a place where people are appreciated for their diversity, are appreciated for their skills and the variety they bring to the workplace and to society, where people are appreciated for their races and genders, and where people from other countries are valued and recognised for their work, life experience and qualifications.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to have equitable access for all. I imagine a life without steps.
If there were one thing that I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to make people who are in positions of advantage and who have a voice, to use that voice to speak up against racism and prejudice and disadvantage, and to help people who need that help.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to have all elected officials reject the politics of fear and hate.
If there was one thing that I would like to do to make Queensland more fair and equitable and inclusive, it would be really great for deaf services and for the deaf to use interpreter service, as well as having Auslan curriculum, people who would care for the deaf community right across Queensland, from Brisbane all the way up to the Cairns and to the Cape, and also to the Gulf and in towns, also inclusive of Indigenous and Aboriginal people, especially those on the islands. It would be really great for Queensland and to have a commitment of provision of service right across Queensland. Thank you. Cheers, bye.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to educate the public about discrimination laws.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be educating employers to become more disability aware.
There's one thing that I'd do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive. It would be for there to be an increased focus on upskilling people with disabilities and mental health issues to help them participate in the mining sector. We know that from both federal government and state government research that there's going to be a massive need of hundreds of thousands of additional workers in the mining sector over the next 5 years. People with disabilities and mental health issues provide a wonderful pool of people to be able to participate in the mining sector.
I believe in the concept of universal access. Opportunities should be freely available to employment, education and services to everyone.
If there was one thing that I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to continue to help bring people and their communities together. By that, I mean continuing to assist people to find their unique gifts and talents, then helping them find ways and places in community to connect with other people and places where those gifts and talents would be welcomed, rewarded, encouraged, supported and so on. When we have people and their communities and both of their gifts and talents come together, we have a genuinely inclusive, strong and welcoming community.
If there's one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to have better internet coverage, especially in Cairns.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be quick and efficient onshore processing of refugees.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be encouraging people to accept people irrespective of their color, culture and creed. Life is like a keyboard. If you press the white key, it gives difference, and if you press the black key, it gives difference, but if you combine the two, it gives you a lovely sound.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be more recognition for my people within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. That really makes a difference.
The fact that I was Attorney General at the time of the passage of the Anti-Discrimination Act is actually an accident of history. It would have happened because it was party policy in some form, but it happened in a different form by virtue of the fact that I happened to be in the position. My own children had only recently been born. They were babies at the time, and there was a newspaper story about a woman who'd been evicted from a restaurant because she was breastfeeding her child. I walked into a meeting of my officers one day ranting how absurd it was that in this restaurant everybody was able to get a feed except the person who needed it most. I said, we ought to do something about this, and one of the officers said, Mr. Attorney, you can. And that's how it came to pass that Queensland was the first jurisdiction in Australia to ban discrimination on the basis of breastfeeding.
I'd like that school kids could go to school and come home without having to pay a bus fare, because school's compulsory, so if it's compulsory it should be free for them to get and home from school.
If there was one thing I could do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to get to know people better, to get to know people for what makes them happy, to get to know what their likes and dislikes are, rather than making judgments about what they look like or where they've come from.
Well, I'd firstly get rid of tax for juniors, mostly when we're just hitting over 18. It's too much for people, especially if someone's pregnant or something. And it's just more, healthy lifestyle for everyone and works for everyone.
Having industrial muscle and protection, basically, because there's so many unscrupulous employers out there.
Long before the Anti-Discrimination Act ever occurred to me, many decades before, it had always struck me that it was strange that we'd only ever had one Shakespeare, one Leonardo da Vinci, only one Einstein, because there ought to have been two. And if we had educated women to the same level that we'd educated men throughout history, we would have had two of each of those. The Anti-Discrimination Act, in part, is about equality. The Anti-Discrimination Act, in part, is about giving everybody an equal opportunity to realise their full potential. But it's also about maximising human potential. The human capital that we have is only capable of being fully released and fully utilised if we have in place legislation like the Anti-Discrimination Act.